Hi, I'm Dr. Angela Toscano, and this is an early access video from my Patreon on romance, love, and literature. For the month of January, I'm discussing the Gothic romance. And for those of you who have read my newsletter, this is going to be a little bit of a deeper dive into some of the early scholarly criticism of popular romance. So I've adapted this presentation from a conference paper I gave at the Popular Cultural Association in 2017. If you have any questions or would like to sign up for my newsletter, please visit me at my website or on my Patreon. The Gothic began as a mid-18th century response to the hyper-rationalism of neoclassical art and literature. The neoclassical age, which generally runs from about 1690 to about 1780, had emphasized characteristics and attitudes we now associate with the Enlightenment. So things like materialism and the scientific method, reason, observation, realism, and satire. The literature of this period is really dominated by empiricist thought. Um, and examples would be things like Alexander Pope, Daniel Defoe, and Jonathan Swift. So, of course, there were other kinds of literature circulating at this period. Of religious literature and poetry has always existed, but the general aesthetic bent was towards rationalism, debunking superstitions, and lauding reason. So, enter stage left, The Castle of Otranto, written in 1764 by Horace Walpole. This novel, set in a medieval past, in a foreign place, and full of supernatural and serendipitous circumstances, signaled a cultural shift away from reason. It also anticipated the romantic turn that began to happen around 1780, some that was back toward nature, feeling and sensibility, looking at history through the eyes of folklore, and an obsession with things unseen, whether they be gods or ghosts. So, two examples of the Gothic of this period are The Monk by Matthew Lewis and The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. So these texts really incorporate elements of the old chivalric romances that dominated in the 12th and 13th centuries with the new realism of early 18th century novels like The Female Quixote and Clarissa by Samuel John by good God, I can't remember. I wrote part of my dissertation on this. By Samuel Richardson, not Samuel Johnson. Those are two different guys, right? In any case, those are some examples of the realist novel. So by the end of the 18th century, Gothics are extremely popular. The 1780s were the height of the Gothic craze. And in this schema, right, thinking about the Gothic as something that's a counterpoint to the Enlightenment, we get the idea that the Gothic is really about questioning reason, questioning materialism, questioning epistemology. So, throughout the 1780s, the Gothics were really popular. The main press for this was the Minerva Press, but they also began to wane in popularity at the beginning of the 19th century. During the 19th century, the Gothic adapted itself to new forms and new genres, mainly through things like horror and detective stories. Some examples of horror would be The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or Dracula. Whereas detective fiction, you could look at the early writings of Edgar Allan Poe or Wilkie Collins' entire oeuvre, but specifically something like The Woman in White. So both as a genre and a mode, the Gothic is always playing with questions of epistemology. It's asking about what we know, how we can know, and what we cannot know. And what we don't know, right? By the time the 20th century rolls around, the Gothic was no longer confined to literary forms. It had adapted itself to new mediums, the most significant of which was the film. This is evidenced principally by Hitchcock's adaptation of Rebecca in 1940, based on the du Maurier novel of the same name, published 2 years previously. And du Maurier's novel revives the female Gothic. Now, the female Gothic is a term literary scholars use to talk about books published in the 1780s that have a heroine protagonist at the center of the text, and that those books usually narrate her experiences within a confined and terrifying domestic space. Besides Anne Radcliffe, who is the main and most famous writer of the female Gothic, you also have the novels of the Bronte sisters, and both of these really influenced du Maurier. So, in rewriting this or taking this genre into the 20th century, du Maurier is really establishing a model for the mid-century Gothic romances that would dominate the paperback market for the two middle decades, the 60s and the 70s of the 20th century. As I discussed in my January newsletter, it was Gerald Gross who was purportedly credited for starting the Gothic craze when he published Phyllis Whitney's Thunder Heights. So both Kay Mussel in Women's Gothic and Romantic Fiction and in Janice Radway's Reading the Romance, both of them identify Gross as starting this this particular phenomenon in the mid-century. Gross himself claims that he was capitalizing on Rebecca's ongoing popularity. And just to give you an example of how popular Rebecca was, it was not only a best-selling novel and has never been out of print, but it was serialized in newspapers. It was adapted to the radio. It was adapted to the stage before it was, of course, most famously adapted as a film. And of course, it has a lot of imitators. Films like Suspicion in 1941 and Gaslight in 1940, both of which developed very similar plots to Rebecca. So you've got Suspicion is about an heiress who marries a handsome playboy and begins to suspect that he's trying to poison her. And of course, in Gaslight, you have a heroine whose husband attempts to drive her insane through a series of manipulations, one of which is tampering with the gas lamps in their home. So these texts, like their 18th century Gothic forebears, deal with the terrors of the domestic space. They wrestle with contemporary fears, specifically women's fears regarding sex, love, marriage, and men's violence. Structurally, then, the mid-century Gothic romances, plot, settings, and characters have a really strong resemblance to the classic Gothic novels of the 18th and 19th century. The difference really is, besides in prose style, that the modern ones tend to emphasize the love story a little bit more than the 18th century counterparts. And of course, they're really identifiable by their covers, unlike what the old adage would have you believe. You can judge a book by its cover. I mean, that is the essence of the marketing department. And if you don't know the quality by the cover, you can surely tell like the genre. So here we have two examples of women in diaphanous nightgowns fleeing ancient mansions and castles. And that's like sort of the quintessential visual depiction of the Gothic romance. So because Gothic romance dominated popular women's reading between the late 1950s and the early 1980s, a lot of the first criticism on popular romance coming out of the Academy was on this genre. This is interesting because at the same time, starting around 1972, you start getting these sweeping historicals that popular romance scholars refer to as blockbuster romances by Kathleen Woodiwiss, Rosemary Rogers, Joanna Lindsay. But those are the ones that early scholars focused on. So today I'm going to explore two of the first forays by feminists and academics into the world of popular romance. And my guiding question is going to be, why did they focus on the Gothic? Why not on the blockbuster romances? Why not on like the Mills and Boon nurse romances, which also were really, really popular during this same period? So to give you an idea of what scholarship was like during this period, I've created like this little timeline for you. And we're just going to start at the top. So in 1973, Joanna Russ published an article entitled "Somebody's Trying to Kill Me, and I Think It's My Husband," which is one of the greatest titles of any published essay of an academic in an academic journal ever, in my opinion. It's pretty amazing. So this is my opinion that this is the first academic work on popular romance. So while Germaine Greer discusses romance reading in The Female Eunuch, it's Russ who really is the first to engage with romance as literature. She actually reads the novels and she talks about specific texts. This was followed in 1975 by Kay Mussel's Beautiful and Damned, The Sexual Woman in Gothic Fiction. Now you can see from this timeline the sporadic discussion of romance in the Academy during this period. Things don't really take off until the late 1970s and early 1980s when all the big monographs were published. So while Gothic fiction from the 18th and 19th century has long been of interest to literary scholars, the popular, and you can, I mean, if you just type Gothic into Google Scholar, you'll see what I'm talking about, like 20 bajillion articles come up. But the popular Gothic romance was not and has not much been discussed. So this, part of this is due to sexism. There's a real masculine aesthetic bias when it comes to looking particularly at popular women's writing, because it views it as fungible and ideologically suspect. And that is the bias that really hasn't left the Academy, even as I'm speaking right now at this moment. So in any case, what is really interesting to me about this timeline is that the Gothic then is like the first subgenre of romance that is studied and published about. I think that this is because, this is interesting because of two things. The first is that romance scholars tend to look at those blockbuster historicals published in the early 70s. Titles of those would be Sweet Savage Love, The Flame and the Flower, Skye O'Malley. And those are really important because they did usher in a boom in romance publishing and also led to the formation of the Romance Writers of America in 1980. But, it's the Gothic romance that really starts and is the focal point of a lot of this scholarship. I mean, both Radway and Modilewski cite Russ in their books published in the 80s. So, in thinking about this, I remembered something that Pamela Regis said Dr. Pamela Regis in a keynote address at the second annual International Association for the Study of Popular Romance. She asked, what do critics owe the romance? And she discussed the work of Radway, Modilewski, Anita Sintow, and Kay Mussel. Anita Sintow. I never pronounced that right, and I apologize. Regis said, quote, the conclusions these critics reached about the romance novel have entered the public consciousness as descriptors of not just the romance novels that they studied, but as characteristics of romance novels, period. So because these descriptors that these scholars choose to use to explore this genre are so embedded in the way that we think about popular romance, I wanted to go back and look at the way that they talk about the Gothic. Because it seems to me that then the Gothic, if what they're all talking about actually is the Gothic in these early instances, then we need to rethink about what that means, right? So the Gothic really is haunting the way that we think about popular romance. Let's then talk about what the patterns of thought or the terms of their discourse really are. So I'm going to give you a list. Okay, so here I'm broadly identifying the patterns I've seen in this early scholarship. And I'm going to get into more specifics with Russ and Mussel. Okay. The first is that critics read the Gothic as a popular representation of women's desires and fears. So at this point, it's important to pause and historicize this a little bit. Russ, Musil, Rodway, Bodlesky, they're all writing during the height of second wave feminism. And so they're not really writing from an intersectional perspective at all. They're very much of their time. So when they say women, you can infer that they're most likely referring to white, cis, straight women of the middle and lower classes. So that's really an important concept to keep in the back of your mind as I'm speaking. So they read these texts as popular representation of women's desires and fears, and they see these texts as being reflective of women's lived experiences and as a way of navigating these experiences through narrative form. Moreover, they understand women's desires and fears as being intimately tied to living under a patriarchal system. Thus, the novels work principally to reintegrate women into the patriarchal order by satisfying those desires through repetitive forms of fiction. The Gothic depicts the domestic space as being broken, and yet fails to fully reject that space in favor of a more progressive feminist ideology. And I think this is why they focus on the Gothic and not nurse romances, because the Gothic does represent the dark underbelly of heterosexual relationships and the domestic space that results from that relationship. I think it sets up the expectation that the Gothic is going to work against normative gender roles, and yet it doesn't totally reject them. In fact, it often reifies them in the happily ever after ending. Whether this is more true for Gothics, though, than Harlequin's and Mills and Boon's novels, I'm not totally sure. Maybe it is. But because the Gothic carries with it this atmospheric ambivalence, especially around the ending, there's something resolved in the tensions in the Gothic, that in the tensions that the book presents, that this, like the Gothic really relies on. And because of that, they seem like they ought to be more feminist than they actually are. And because of this, I think they were very frustrating to early feminist scholars. So the terms under which they're read then become the general rubric under which most romance is read and understood by critics both during this period and really up until the turn of the 20th century to the 21st. Okay, so Joanna Russ's article, Somebody's Trying to Kill Me, and I think it's my husband, The Modern Gothic, is published in the Journal of Popular Culture in 1973. I would categorize her approach as structural. That is, she's interested in the tropes, conventions, and really the building blocks of plot and story, like across text, right? But her tone's not really academic. She brings a very particular sort of voice to this article. I would describe it as wry, even sardonic. She's much more of a theater critic than she is a theorist. The principal significance of Russ's article in terms of the method is the way that she breaks down and works to provide a morphology of the Gothic romance. So she just identifying its main tropes: the house, the heroine, the super male, another woman, the shadow male, the young girl, the buried ominous secret, and the secret revealed. And then she discusses the essential shape of the plot. So, for example, she says, at some point, either because of other people's detective work or by chance, the secret is revealed. However, this also exemplifies the primary problem with Russ's article. She names the tropes, but she's not interested in what they are doing specifically within a specific text. So her wry breakdown of the Gothic's cliches allows her to slide over points that ought to be attended to. If this is a mystery, then why is the secret revealed by chance rather than detective work? This is one of those incongruities that should make a close reader sit up and take notice. But these things are not curiosities worth investigating for Russ because they're really actually more indicative of something pernicious at work in these stories. She further notes similar naughty points, saying, quote, the books are not love stories per se, nor are they usually concerned with erotica. And elsewhere, the commonest emotion in these novels is fear, but they are not horror stories. The plots always involve murder, but they are not stories of detection. And while the heroine is rewarded with love without having caused it, deserved it, revealed it, or even asked for it, there is no tracing of the growing bond between lovers. These are really insightful and significant points about how the Gothic works, and I would agree with her principal assertions. Yet Russ never answers the question why regarding any of these claims. Why aren't they horror stories? Why is there no detection? Why doesn't it trace the relationship? Rather, for Russ, these points signal the failure of the Gothic romance to achieve narrative depth. Her tone, while amusing to read, is dismissive, reductive, and superior, taking the position that American women's reading is mostly frivolous. Slicks and fashion mags, she says. So the dismissive attitude informs the principal position Russ takes throughout the essay. And while she asserts that, quote, certainly the Gothic is worth some study as a genre written for women and by women, end quote, the sense is that it is only so because they reveal something about women in America themselves. Indeed, Russ argues, quote, the modern Gothics are a direct expression of the traditional feminine situation, etc. So though Russ attends to the actual text, noting their elements, quoting from them, she doesn't see these texts as doing anything or even capable of doing anything other than, quote, directly expressing the traditional feminine situation. And consequently, solacing the readers back into the conformity of patriarchal norms. So, what I want to do now is to look at the way Russ reads the Gothic and talk about that by focusing on one of her major points, which is the heroine's passivity. So, Russ says, and this is the point of contention here, most striking about these novels is the combination of intrigue, crime, and danger with the heroine's complete passivity. Unconscious foci of intrigue, passion, and crime, these young women, none of whom is over 30, wander through all sorts of threatening forces of which they are intuitively but never intellectually aware. Most of all, they are of extraordinary interest to everyone, even though they are ill-educated, ordinary, characterless, and usually very hazily delineated, being, as one might suspect, a stand-in for the reader. Sometimes heroines are very beautiful, although they don't know it, or heiresses, which they don't know either, or possess some piece of information about the secret, which they are incapable of interpreting. Their connection with the action of the novel is always passive. They are focal points for tremendous emotion and sometimes tremendous struggle simply because they exist. Wow, what a paragraph. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to go back to the other slide. So what's frustrating to me about this is that Russ accurately identifies the structure and motor of the Gothic romance. But again, she in no way explores it. She says that these novels depict the traditional feminine situation, but never asks why. She points to the ambiguity surrounding the supermale and his patriarchal authority, but never explores what this might suggest about heterosexual women's desires and fears. Russ skates across these points, seeing them as signs of complicity. She rarely acknowledges nuance in the conventions or difference among texts that is anything more than superficial. If we agree with Russ that these novels depict the traditional feminine situation, and that this situation is one in which a passive woman is at the mercy of a man who she cannot read well, who she does not know well, that she does not know whether he or not he is in love with her or if he's trying to kill her. If the heroine then is also prevented from knowing any knowledge that directly affects her, and if she is prevented from acting because she does not know what she does not know, then might we not say that this lack of knowledge, this situation is precisely the point of the story? Is not that subversive in itself? What does this tell us about how to think or understand the traditional feminine situation. Russ identifies the crux of the matter, which she says simply because they exist. But she does not notice that this is the crux of the matter. In my own analysis, I would argue that the violence of the novel finds its focal point in the heroine, not because she is special, but because she is a woman. There is no safe ontological position for certain persons, and woman is one of them. There is no safe epistemology either. Neither knowing or being prevents the heroine from facing violence. This is why the heroine's passivity is contrasted to her double, the other woman's assertiveness. They are a site of structural violence simply because they exist. I would argue that the Gothic romance undoes the idea that curiosity or experience or morality or lack thereof is what engenders violence against women. Both the heroine and the other woman, through their strange resemblance to each other, face the same kind of violence. So Rusk later asks, what does this doubling mean? Is it that every woman fears the same man and undergoes the same fate? Fuck yes, it is. That is exactly, yes, Russ, yes, Joanna. That is the point. This doubling, where every woman fears the same man and undergoes the same fate, suggests that the repetition of the Gothic tropes are important, because even though the form is the same, the plot is different within each text. They're working through that tension that is cultural, that's inherited from patriarchy, that women are forced to replay and repeat the same story as their mothers and grandmothers, across, cultures and generations, because of patriarchalized systemic abuse, right? So, but for us, this repetition isn't revealing something about the systemic generational violence of patriarchy, right? It's a sign of narrative failure. Russ's conclusion that I will go and read another Gothic novel suggests that the Gothic is pernicious because it fails to free women from their cherished chains of bondage, to paraphrase Greer, and only incites in them further desire for it. Okay. Kay Mussel has like a very similar take, even though her focus is a bit different. Her essay, Beautiful and Damned, The Sexual Woman in Gothic Fiction, is also published in the Journal of Popular Culture, but 2 years later in 1975. Like Russ, Mussel sees the Gothic as directly expressing social mores and the feminine mystique. She says these novels, while toying with forbidden acts and illicit sexuality, represent and reinforce a world in which traditional values about men, women, sexuality, and marriage still hold true. Mussel then sees the Gothic romances as contiguous with magazines like Playboy, implying in their proximity that they too are a kind of pornography, or that pornography also paradoxically reinforces traditional values. All right, so for Mussel, this popular representation of sex reinforces the double standard that permits sex for men and not women. This double standard, she argues, relates to this aspect of the modern Gothic. So the portrayal of the female characters who fail to control their sexuality, this is Mussel, and the assurance for the reader that such lack of control leads to defeat. If society assumes that these novels indicate that the proper goal for women is marriage, passionate women who fail to perform their proper function under the double standard are a threat to the social regulation of sex, and specifically to the family. Thus, the focus of Mussel's article is on an examination of how the other woman in the Gothic novel is contrasted to the heroine, and how that this contrast reinforces traditional feminine roles. I'm not sure what I would call her methodological approach. It's certainly feminist, as is Russ's. Both do this thing, though, where they kind of have like a mimetic equivalency going on. One that really gets picked up by Modlesky and Radway. It's more apparent in Muscle, though, than it is in Russ. And that's the idea that what is happening in the novel is also happening in the world, or that the novel is designed as a kind of propaganda, or that the novel is a clear window onto women's lived experiences, or that the novel is reflective of unmediated and consistent social values. Indeed, she argues that, quote, popular literature tends to reflect conservative social values, which may be the case, but does it reflect those clearly without any shadows, nuances, or contradictions? I don't really think so. So for Muscle, the other woman in the Gothic novel works to highlight how unfeminine behavior gets punished in our culture, right? She says that although on the surface these women possess beauty, quote, an important attribute for a woman in attracting and holding a man, that this is actually a handicap because it attracts men too easily, subjecting its possessor to temptations in somewhat more acute ways than her plainer rivals. Okay. Beauty then is punished in these novels because it is transitory, unstable, and shallow. Moreover, for Muscle, beauty is invariably linked to the other woman's sexuality and her expression of it. What is important for Muscle is that the novels reject beauty as a proper feminine quality in favor of domestic skills. This is a theme she picks up in her book Fantasy and Reconciliation, and there she calls it the domestic test. Okay, so it doesn't really feel like Muscle read any of these texts. I mean, I'm sure that she did, but she primarily provides evidence in the form of block quotations, citing scenes in which the other women's beauty is described. Modlesky in Loving with a Vengeance uses this same technique. The manner of providing evidence suggests two things to me. First is that there's no distinction among these texts, and second, that their meaning is clear and transparent. By using this litany of example, Muscle goes on to argue that the Gothics punish the sexually desiring woman. She says, quote, another demonstrates her corruption explicitly by being vulgar enough to talk about her sexual interest in the hero, before providing a long quote from that book. She then adds to this quote, I mean, she never close reads the quote. I really want to emphasize that. She then adds to this quote, perhaps appropriately, Danielle is murdered by the villain during sexual intercourse. Danielle is typical of those women who, while not actually villains themselves, are corrupted through their sexual attraction for and to the villains, suggesting that attraction alone is a poor way to establish a relationship. So my Martinelli reads, LOL, isn't it though? And I can offer no deeper insight into this curious point she's making here. I mean, yeah, I guess it is a poor way to establish a relationship, especially if you get murdered during sex. What? Okay. So part of the reason Muscle argues then that these other women are punished is not just because they're sexual, but because they do not allow their natural instincts to prevail and invariably fail in traditional feminine roles, most notably motherhood. This allows the heroine to achieve success as, quote, a surrogate mother. Moreover, this competition between women is further reinforced by the lack of female friendships in these Gothics. Honestly, I feel like she read like a lot of Dorothy Eden. I feel like this is like very Dorothy Eden, but never mind about that. Okay, so to support this reading, Muscle looks at like a couple of specific books, chiefly this passage from Mary Seward's Nine Coaches Waiting, which I found really odd as a justification for her reading of the other woman. So, where is that quote? Right. Okay. So I don't have the quote up here. I'm sorry. So the quote from Nine Coaches Waiting is this. I'm not wicked Hippolyte. You know that. I didn't want to hurt Philippe, but well, it was for Leon's sake. I did it for Leon. So I think this is a weird passage for Muscle to have pulled because I read this book and I would not describe the character of Heloise, as either sexual or passionate. Rather, Stewart depicts her as this elegant, sickly, weak woman living in the shadow of her domineering and charismatic husband. If anything, the depiction of Heloise is one of a woman in an abusive relationship, not a woman undone by her passions. This failure to read the specifics of Heloise's character is indicative of the major issue with Mussel's reading of Gothics generally. Since she makes no distinctions between texts, all differences and nuances are collapsed. They're all the same. This sameness in plot results in a sameness of ideological position. Because the texts are not wholly progressive, they must therefore be wholly conservative. There's no sense that they are working through ambivalences about women's roles, about sexuality, about women's own desires, about other women, and about domesticity. Instead, the Gothic uphold, quote, traditional values as marriage and motherhood as ultimate goals for women, the superiority of domesticity over sexuality, and the feminine responsibility for nurturing and maintaining the family unit, end quote. So while Russ is concerned with the way the novels regurgitate the same conservative ideology over and over again through the repetitious use of tropes, I'm sorry, let me repeat that. So while Joanna Russ is concerned with the way the novels regurgitate the same conservative ideology over and over again through the repetitious use of tropes, Kay Mussel is concerned with the way the Gothic reinforces traditional gender norms through the use of the double. So, in short, they're making very similar arguments about the Gothic, even though each article has a different focus. And I think Mussel's is a lot more specific. So, to conclude, I want to break down what these critics are doing. Not only these critics, but I think a lot of early romance critics are doing these things. I don't want to do, though, the same thing that Russ and Mussel do, which is to not acknowledge the difference in nuance. Rodway's project is very different than Modleski's project, is very different from Mussel's project, is very different from Russ's project. And they offered like a lot of like really important interpretations and research to the field. But I think that these 8 shared sort of perspectives really limit some of the possibilities for their interpretations and have like haunted romance criticism in a really unproductive and problematic way, where you're always having to defend the romance as being not just conservative, not just sexist or, whatever the problem is, right? And that binary of it's either like conservative or it's progressive or it's either this or it's either that, I think inhibits a lot of really specific, particular interpretations of specific texts, because people don't want to look at them as singular, but as an undifferentiated whole. Okay, so all of them mark the Gothics as the same, right? Sameness is really like a key term for me. Variation is peripheral and it's not significant. They all see these texts as being unequivocally conservative. They don't recognize the tensions happening in the novels. They see repetition as bad, as a sign of both aesthetic and ideological failure. And they rightly point to the traditional gender roles that work in the Gothic, but do not see any tension in these representations. They also don't remark upon the ambivalence that is really the defining feature of the Gothic as a whole. They regard these texts as being directly expressive of women's lived experience and an undistorted reflection of cultural norms. They see these texts as complicit in women's continued complacency under patriarchy, and they see these texts as products, not art objects. So I think that this list is something that I would really love everybody to sort of carry forward in their mind as a way of navigating romance. We want to see it not as a as a product where everything is the same, like an iPhone or something like that, but really as different texts doing different things under these generic categories. All right. Well, I hope you found this interesting. If you have any comments or questions, stick them below or shoot me an email or find me on Twitter. All right. Have a good night, and I will talk to you soon.